Step off the porch now.
This is my house. What's the legal reason?
You got a call. Suspicious person trying to enter.
The porch light snapped on as the front door closed behind him, bathing the narrow walkway in a soft yellow glow. It was late quiet enough that the sound of keys brushing metal felt louder than it should have. A trimmed lawn, identical houses, the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever made the news. He reached for the lock. "Police, don't move." The voice came from the edge of the driveway, sharp and sudden. A flashlight beam cut across the siding, then straight into his face. Another light followed from the street, brighter, bluer, pulsing once before going steady. He froze, keys still in his hand. Two officers moved in, fast boots on concrete, hands already positioned near their belts. One stayed back by the cruiser, the other closed distance, scanning him from head to toe like a problem that needed solving. "Sir, step away from the door." "This is my house," he said calmly. The officer did not slow, hands where I can see them. He raised them immediately, palms open, shoulders relaxed. The porch camera clicked softly, its red indicator glowing steady. Across the street, a curtain shifted. "What's going on?" he asked evenly. "We got a call," the officer said. "Report of a suspicious individual attempting to enter a residence." The words landed heavy in the still air. "I live here. We'll determine that." The flashlight beam lingered on his face, then his jacket, then the door behind him. The officer's partner angled slightly to block the walkway positioning without explanation. "Do you have identification?" "Yes." He reached, slowly narrating the movement, and handed over his wallet. The officer barely glanced at it before asking again, "Why are you really here tonight?" "I came home." The officer's jaw tightened. "Step down off the porch." He hesitated just long enough to be deliberate, then stepped down, shoes touching the concrete path he had walked every night for years. The officer followed, crowding spacelight, never leaving his face. "Sir," the officer said, "your story isn't lining up." The porch light illuminated the house number clearly above the door. His name was etched on a small brass plate near the mailbox. None of it mattered. A neighbor's door opened halfway. Someone whispered from inside. A phone lifted briefly, then dropped. The officer keyed his radio. "I've got a subject refusing to cooperate." "I am cooperating," he said calmly. "I am standing in my yard with my hands up." The second officer shifted, scanning the street, then the house, then back to him. The radio crackled again. "Turn around," the first officer ordered. "On what grounds?" "Now." He turned slowly, facing away from his own front door, the one place he should have been safest. Cold air brushed his wrists as metal came out of the officer's hand. The click of cuffs sounded louder than the porch light had. In that moment, the accusation became physical. Not a question. Not a check. A decision made under a light that was never meant to be threatening. Behind him, the house stood silent. The camera recorded everything. And somewhere in the system the officers were about to consult was a name they had prosecuted cases beside, argued law with, and sworn oaths to uphold. They just did not know it yet. The scene on that porch could only be understood if you did not know who the man in handcuffs really was. To the officers responding, he was just another name on a call sheet. To the federal justice system, he was a prosecutor whose signature carried weight in courtrooms far beyond that quiet street. Aaron Whitfield had spent nearly 2 decades inside the federal system, where precision mattered more than volume and mistakes carried permanent consequences. He built cases patiently, line by line, knowing that every assumption would be challenged and every shortcut exposed. His reputation was not built on theatrics, but on discipline. He won cases because he prepared for the ones he might lose. He grew up understanding scrutiny, being careful with words, careful with movement, careful with authority. As a federal prosecutor, he learned to separate suspicion from proof, because lives depended on that distinction. He had argued before judges who demanded articulation for every decision. That standard shaped everything about how he moved through the world. Outside of work, Whitfield lived deliberately small. No government plates, no titles shared with neighbors, no security detail. His home was his one private space, a place where he did not expect to explain himself or justify his presence. The officers outside had a different background. One was new to patrol, confident in procedure, but untested by consequence. His record showed assertiveness, willingness to act, and a tendency to escalate early. Prior complaints had been noted, not sustained. He had been told to be careful with tone. He had not been forced to confront why. The call that brought them there was vague. Suspicious male attempting entry. No forced door. No active threat. Just a perception passed through dispatch and translated into authority before anyone asked the most basic question. Who lives here? On the porch, Whitfield recognized the pattern immediately. A narrative forming before facts. A decision made before verification. He did not raise his voice. He did not identify himself. He understood the importance of the record. Body cameras, door cameras, neighbor phones. Those would speak later. Standing cuffed in front of his own door, he thought of defendants who had stood in similar positions, calm but powerless, while assumptions hardened around them. He thought of arguments he had made about constitutional limits, about the sanctity of the home, about how easily authority could cross a line when it felt justified. Across the street, a neighbor stepped fully outside, now phone raised openly. Another porch light came on. The quiet street had gained witnesses. The officers had no idea that the man they had just restrained was someone who trained others on lawful procedure, who had dismissed cases when stops went too far, who had built his career on the principle that power without justification was abuse. And somewhere in the systems they were about to check was a profile they had seen before attached to cases they had sworn to respect. The night had only begun to reveal itself. The tension on the porch thickened as the officers settled into their positions. One stood close enough that Aaron Whitfield could feel the heat from his body through the night air. The other angled toward the sidewalk, scanning the street as if expecting danger to emerge from the dark. "What's your full name?" the first officer asked. "Aaron Whitfield." The officer repeated it into his radio without looking up, already shaping the cadence of a report. He kept his flashlight trained on Whitfield's upper back, the beam steady, deliberate. "Why didn't you answer when we approached?" he continued. "I was unlocking my door." "That's not what it looked like." Across the street, a neighbor spoke quietly into a phone, then stopped when the officer glanced over. The red porch camera light stayed solid, indifferent to everyone's nerves. The second officer shifted closer now, voice lower. "Sir, why don't you just tell us why you're really here tonight so we can clear this up?" "This is my residence," Whitfield replied evenly. "I've told you that." The first officer exhaled sharply, impatience creeping in. "You're being evasive." Whitfield said nothing. Silence, he knew, often irritated people who expected submission. The cuffs rested cold against his wrists, tighter than necessary, but not enough to cause injury. Just enough to assert control. A radio crackled. "Dispatch asking for confirmation." The first officer answered with clipped responses, emphasizing the word suspicious, repeating it until it sounded factual. The neighbor across the street raised their phone higher now. Another porch light flicked on down the block. A car slowed, then stopped entirely, driver watching through the windshield. "Sir," the first officer said, "you're not making this easy." "I am complying with every lawful instruction," Whitfield replied. "I am asking why I am restrained at my own home." The officer ignored the question. He circled slightly, boots scraping concrete. "You know, people who belong don't usually act like this." That sentence hung into the air, heavy and unmistakable. Whitfield closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. He focused on the sound of the camera, the rhythm of the street, the importance of staying precise. Every word spoken here would matter later. The second officer leaned toward his partner and spoke under his breath, too quiet for the microphone to catch. The first officer shook his head, still committed to the posture he had chosen. Another patrol car's headlights appeared at the end of the street, sweeping slowly closer. "Back up." Whitfield felt the moment shift. More uniforms meant more witnesses, more voices, more chances for the narrative to either correct itself or harden beyond repair. The officer straightened as the second cruiser pulled in. Doors opened. Footsteps approached. The night, once quiet, now held an audience. This was no longer a simple check at a front door. It was a public scene, recorded from multiple angles, shaped by decisions already made. And the most dangerous part of it all was that the assumptions were still driving the process. The backup cruiser stopped halfway down the street, lights washing over the houses in slow pulses. Two more officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts, eyes moving from Whitfield to the front door, to the cuffs, to the neighbors now standing openly on their porches. "What's the situation?" one of them asked. "Suspicious individual," the first officer said quickly. "Possible attempted entry." Refusing to explain his presence, Whitfield turned his head slightly. "I explained it. This is my home." The first officer tightened his grip on the cuffs, as if the words themselves were resistance. "Sir, stop talking." The injustice crystallized in that moment. Not loud, not violent, just absolute. A man restrained on his own property because his explanation had been dismissed before it was heard. The second officer glanced at the door behind Whitfield. The house number, the mailbox plate. He frowned slightly, then looked back at his partner. "Did we verify residency?" he asked. The first officer waved it off. "We're getting there." Getting there meant keeping Whitfield in cuffs while questions were asked in the wrong order. The flashlight beam cut across his shoulders again, then into the open doorway behind him as if the house itself were suspect. "Turn him around," the first officer said. "For what reason?" the second officer asked quietly. "Officer safety." Whitfield was repositioned, forced to face the street, now neighbors and phones in front of him. The porch light behind him went unnoticed. The door he had unlocked moments earlier stood ajar, exposed. A neighbor called out, "That's his house. I see him every day." The first officer snapped back, "Sir, stay out of this." Another neighbor whispered, "They're cuffing him at his own door." The backup officers exchanged looks. Something was off. The tone. The lack of urgency paired with unnecessary restraint. The absence of any clear crime. One of the backup officers stepped closer to Whitfield. "Sir, do you have proof of residency inside?" "Yes," Whitfield replied. "On the kitchen counter. I can point it out if you remove the cuffs." The first officer cut in immediately. Not happening. The street had gone quiet now. No one spoke. Phones kept recording. The porch camera kept blinking. This was the point where discretion should have intervened, where verification should have replaced assumption. Instead, pride filled the gap. The first officer keyed his radio again. "We're detaining him until we sort this out. Detaining without cause. At a private residence, on camera." Whitfield felt the weight of it settle fully. Not fear, clarity. The line had been crossed. Every element he had spent his career arguing in court was now present in real time. Warrantless detention. Lack of exigent circumstances. Assumptions hardening into action. He spoke once more calmly. "Officer, you are violating my rights." The officer did not respond. The injustice was complete. Everything from this moment forward would not be about suspicion. It would be about accountability. And somewhere in the systems now being accessed, the officers were seconds away from seeing a title that would make every decision they had just made impossible to defend. The change came quietly, not with a shout or a command, but with a pause that lasted half a second too long. One of the backup officers had stepped away from the group tablet in hand, checking the address tied to the call. He frowned, then typed again slower this time. His eyes moved back and forth between the screen and the man standing cuffed under his own porch light. He walked back towards the others. "Who did you say this was again?" "Aaron Whitfield," the first officer replied, irritation edging his voice. The backup officer nodded once and turned the tablet so the screen was visible only to the officers. The glow reflected faintly on their faces. The first officer leaned in. His expression shifted. The certainty drained, first replaced by confusion, then disbelief. He straightened. "Wait, what is that?" The backup officer spoke carefully now. "That's a federal profile. Active, United States Attorney's Office. Prosecutor." The street went still. The second officer took a step back without realizing it. The words settled heavy, undeniable. Federal Prosecutor. The title did not raise its voice. It did not need to. The first officer stared at Whitfield's back, then at the cuffs, then at the house number above the door. The pieces aligned all at once, too late to soften what had already happened. "Sir," the backup officer said, voice shifting respectful. "Now I need to apologize. We are confirming your identity." Whitfield turned his head slightly. "You just did." The first officer's throat tightened. He reached for the cuffs without being told, hands suddenly clumsy. The metal clicked open. Cold pressure vanished from Whitfield's wrists. He rolled his shoulders, once steadying himself, face unreadable. "I am a federal prosecutor," Whitfield said calmly. "I live here. Everything that just happened is on camera." No one argued. The backup officer nodded. "Yes, sir. It is." The first officer tried to speak. "I didn't know who you were." Whitfield looked at him. That was never relevant. The sentence landed harder than any raised voice could have. A supervisor's voice crackled over the radio, now aware of what the system had revealed. "Units hold position," neighbors murmured. Phones stayed raised. The porch camera blinked on, recording a moment that had already crossed into consequence. Whitfield glanced at his front door, still ajar. Then back at the officers. "You detained me without cause," he said evenly. "At my home. In front of witnesses. That is now part of the record." The backup officer nodded again, slower this time. "Yes, sir." The reveal had not come with triumph. It came with weight. The kind that does not fade when the lights turn off. What had started as profiling had just collided with federal authority, documented in full, with no room left for explanation. And everyone present understood the same thing at once. This was no longer a mistake that could be corrected quietly. The response moved faster than anyone on that street expected. Within minutes, supervisors arrived, then command staff. Body camera footage was flagged and locked. Doorbell video was copied on scene. Neighbor recordings were logged before anyone left. The language on the radios shifted from suspicion to preservation. Aaron Whitfield stood quietly on his porch, wrists free, now watching procedure snap into place with a familiarity he had lived on the other side for years. Names were taken, badge numbers recorded, statements separated. The first officer was pulled aside, no longer speaking, no longer directing anything. A federal liaison was notified before midnight. By morning, an interagency investigation was opened. Not a review, an investigation. The distinction mattered. The initial report written by the first officer was compared against video within hours. The discrepancies were immediate. Claims of refusal did not match the footage. Assertions of threat were unsupported. The justification for detention collapsed frame by frame. Internal affairs moved in parallel. Prior complaints resurfaced. Patterns that had once been described as tone issues were reclassified under escalation and bias. Training records were reviewed. Warnings that had been minimized were read again, this time without excuses. The officer was placed on administrative leave that night. His weapon and badge were surrendered before sunrise. Interviews followed, then charges, federal civil rights violations, false statements, unlawful detention, abuse of authority under color of law. The court process did not linger. Evidence was overwhelming. Cameras had captured everything from first command to final cuff. Neighbors testified. Dispatch logs contradicted the officer's narrative. There was no version left to defend. The sentence came down months later. 15 years in federal prison. A career ended before the uniform was even dry from its last shift. Pension forfeited. Certification revoked. Name removed from roles he would never touch again. The department issued statements about reform and accountability. Policies were rewritten. Training mandates expanded. Door approach protocols were revised statewide. But none of it softened the reality that one decision on a quiet porch had detonated an entire future. Whitfield filed a civil action not for spectacle, but for structure. The settlement funded independent oversight and mandatory auditing of home-based encounters. He declined interviews. He returned to work. Justice did not arrive loudly. It arrived through documentation, jurisdiction, and consequences that could not be negotiated away. A front porch, a camera, a moment of profiling that turned into a federal case, and a reminder written into sentencing records that authority at the threshold of someone's home is not a suggestion. It is a constitutional boundary. The final lesson of what happened on that front porch does not live in the sentence handed down or the headlines that followed. It lives in the boundary that was crossed and how absolute that boundary is supposed to be. In American law, the home is not just another location. It is the most protected space a person has. Without a warrant, exigent circumstances, or clear consent, law enforcement authority stops at the threshold. Suspicion does not override that line. Discomfort does not soften it. Race appearance or assumption never justify crossing it. When officers ignore that boundary, they are not bending rules, they are breaking constitutional law. What failed here was not training in theory. It was discipline in practice. The officer treated a vague call as permission to escalate. He treated questions as resistance. He treated calm as defiance. And once that posture was adopted, every subsequent decision was made to protect ego rather than rights. That is how unlawful encounters become crimes under color of law. There is also a deeper psychological failure worth confronting. Profiling often hides behind urgency. Officers convince themselves they are acting quickly to prevent harm, when in reality they are reacting to bias reinforced by authority. The moment force or restraint is used to resolve uncertainty instead of evidence, the system has already failed. For civilians, the lessons are precise and critical. You do not have to open your door to police without a warrant. You have the right to ask why they are there. You have the right to remain silent. Cameras matter. Neighbors matter. The record begins the moment contact is made, not after something goes wrong. Calm documentation is not provocation. It is protection. For law enforcement, the lesson is unforgiving. Power does not expand at night. It does not expand because a call sounds suspicious. It does not expand because someone does not look like they belong. Authority at someone's home is limited by design, and violating that limit carries consequences that no badge can shield. This story matters because Aaron Whitfield did not provoke the outcome. He did not assert status. He did not reveal his profession until the system exposed itself. The injustice happened before anyone knew who he was. That is the part that defines the case. Most people will never be federal prosecutors. Most will never see a wrongful detention turn into a 15-year sentence for the officer who caused it. That is exactly why this matters. Because without cameras, without witnesses, without federal reach, many similar encounters never reach accountability. Justice in this case did not arrive through confrontation. It arrived through evidence, jurisdiction, and law applied the way it was written. Quiet, exact, permanent. The question that remains is not whether the punishment was severe. The question is how many doors are knocked on every night under the same assumptions, and how many of those moments end without anyone being held responsible. Because at the threshold of a home, the Constitution is not optional, and when it is ignored, the consequences are not negotiable.